You had to go to your sale shoot.
Torres tí a me dwi sio told dollars ski that we make our cold trams our home trams as you did it was valid so as you man hang up with be that round. Welcome everybody, good to see such a crowd out given that there's so many other activities going on tonight both within the district and up in Stornoway. Welcome, even quite central and at the moment from the dark side. To the district. So, thank you. She don't want this more. But it's a one is going to ski that she's not saying, but the one is going to ski the games we and welcome to face in the district either way. Donald Macaulay, and he was originally going to give a talk, but then decided that probably a question and answer would be better. So I defer. Being chairman of the Coinneach, the only skill I have is delegation. So I very quickly pass that to somebody who's a lot better than me. So you'll be going to more again. So shoot them at the region in my own counties and America. About his soldier to South America.
That's twice this week he has used his authority to get me to do the talking when I should have been him. So he has learned the art of chairmanship somewhere else, if not for long, with the Coinneach. We thought it would be really interesting to have John here tonight because we've heard him in the church, and I've also done an interview with him which is on YouTube in Gaelic, in which he tells us a lot about himself, but we haven't heard an awful lot about the many years that he spent in South America. And the reason we put the map of South America up there, I know it's quite small in many ways, but it's just many of us maybe don't really have an idea in our heads of what is South America, what are the countries of South America, and what the differences are maybe to ourselves. So the map is up there, and maybe now and again John might feel that he has to exercise his teaching abilities to tell us a little bit about the geography as well. So anyway, many welcome to Coinneach Ski the Vach. And before we come to that, I didn't get the chance either in the video and I don't think you told it in the church either about the dog you had here when your father was the minister here. And I want you to tell people about the dog.
It was actually the second dog. It was a puppy from the first dog that we had. The first dog was called Daisy. Not my choice. And this one was called Bobby. Uh-huh. I called him Bobby. He was my dog. And when he was very little, I can remember at a communion, he was brought in, or I had him in the house. And of course the time came, I think it was a Friday evenings of the communion, and the time came to have the Lord watered. And of course everybody gathered in the room, and I was, of course, as usual, present, and I had the dog there, little puppy, in my arms. And as soon as he was asleep, but as soon as we started singing in Gaelic, up went the head. Ow! And that was the start of it. he never stopped singing. From the time he was a little puppy until he was much, much older. On a Thursday night, for example, he would sit on the wall up there at the manse, and you could hear the Gaelic singing from the church here, you know. And he would be howling away on the wall by himself, quite happily all the time. On Sundays he was locked in, except on one famous occasion when I used to escape across the road to Neil Hamish's house, and Katrina will remember this very well. Neil and I decided to play a tape recording of Donald Macaulay. Now, there's going back a bit. Donald Macaulay presenting in Gaelic. And of course the dog was with me. And of course he started, you know. Started singing immediately. And it wasn't 2 or 3 minutes before my father appeared at the door of the manse and, you know, yelled him and called him in. So that was, he was a singer all his life, but only in Gaelic. Only in Gaelic.
There's a lot of things you can only do in Gaelic.
I'll take your word for it.
But anyway, I thought that was hilarious, and now we have it for the record. That was the case. Now, the topic for tonight is South America. And as I said at the beginning, it's not really part of the world that our generation is familiar with, although previous generations on this island were very familiar with parts of South America, not necessarily the parts that you were in.
Yes and no. The majority of them went to Patagonia, but they were also in the highlands of Peru as well. And I can remember when I was researching something, finding a newspaper cutting from the Gazette. I think it was around 1870, where they were offered free passage to go and shepherd in either, I think it was in Peru at that time, and they got free passage as long as they had their dog with them. And it's fascinating to see in the travels that we did, particularly in Patagonia, and most of Patagonia when I was down there, but also in the high Andes in Peru. Every sheepdog is a black and white collie, and they're all descended from dogs that were taken from here, all of them.
Yeah. It's very interesting, and there are many stories about that. I knew a man from Balalan one time who spoke fluent Spanish, and he had actually been working in Peru in the copper mines.
Yeah, big copper mines, yeah. Big copper mines in the north of Chile as well. Copper is still Chile's main export.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, but most of us tonight are going to talk about Chile and Peru. So you might as well tell us, I don't know if you can see the map very well, but just so we have an idea of the geography of it, where they are.
Well, where are they? At the bottom end of South America, of course. I thought you would, being so technologically minded here, you would have a laser pointer to point to things, but you don't. This is where I was based most of the time, in Santiago, most of the time that I was there. I spent 17 years in Chile altogether, but with a couple of breaks, and 8 in Peru, in Lima in Peru.
What's interesting though is the shape of the country, you know, Chile itself.
Yeah, it's a very long, thin country, as you can see. And it's, Chile falls into 3 natural regions. That's what I mean.
Has anybody got a walking stick?
The north of Chile is all desert, and it's quite spectacular in its own way. The central part, where Santiago is, and a bit further south, is Mediterranean climate. It's very, very like the Mediterranean coasts, and very similar. And then you have what's called the south of Chile, which comes down to about here, which is extremely similar to Scotland. If you were travelling around it, you would think you were in Scotland, except for a volcano here and there. But then you have the deep south, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego here at the bottom, and the Beagle Channel and so on. And I was lucky enough to get all the way right down here. So I've travelled Chile and Peru almost completely from north to south, all the way in both directions. Peru is very different, by the way. Peru is, the coast is desert, and then you have the Andes mountain range, and then you have the Amazon jungle. So the geography in Peru is quite different. There's a lot of differences between the two countries.
Well, what you get microphone, I'm pretty sure.
Well, my precious, I could get you all right.
No, I just thought it would be worth a while just establishing where exactly these countries are. Because I'm not, at times I'm not too sure myself. No, so how on earth did you end up?
I knew you were going to ask that.
So therefore you have prepared an answer.
Well,
how did you end up in South America?
By complete accident, or by God's providence.
I was going to say that's not what you would say up in the pulpit by.
When you look back at it now, of course, you can see God's hand, you know, in all these things in a way that at the time I didn't have any either interest in or perception of. I had never intended to go to South America. I'd been teaching in Glasgow for 12 years, and to be honest, I was getting a bit fed up. I'd been in the same post for 6 years, I think, and it was a time, and Mr. McLennan will know this very well, there comes a time where the promotion ladder in schools just churns up because so many young guys have been promoted. And you have to literally wait for someone to die before there's any possibility of another step. And I'd always wanted to teach abroad. In fact, I had been planning to go to Canada in 1970. And my cousin was working in Saskatchewan at that particular time. And she said, come over, you know, there's loads of jobs in Canada. And I'd gone through all the process for that. And I had everything ready to go, including a job lined up. And I didn't go at the last minute. Don't ask me why, I don't know, but I just, you know, it just didn't feel like the right thing to do. But this was 12 years later. I'd started applying for jobs to go overseas. And the place that I really wanted to go to was, I think I may have told this before, I wanted to go to Singapore. And I'd applied for a job in Singapore, and at the same time I applied for a British Council job in Bogota, in Colombia. Not really because I wanted to go to Colombia, but just to get on the, you know, the British Council interview chain, etc., which was quite useful at the time. And I got called to London for interview for the British Council job, and it was very strange. It was the first thing the guy said to me when I went in. He said, you've come about the Bogota job. I said, yeah. He says, you're not going to get it. And I thought, well, why have you brought me down here, you know, all the way to London? He said, but there's a job coming up in Santiago in Chile. He said, that we'd like you to apply for. And he said, would you be interested in that? Now, to be honest, I knew absolutely nothing about Chile at the time, nothing at all, except that there'd been a major revolution there in 1973, and the government had been overthrown, and there was a military government that was in charge ever since then. That was pretty much all I knew. And I said, yeah, okay, yeah, well, why not? So he went ahead with the interview for that particular job. And fine, interview concluded. Of course, it's they don't offer you the job then. It's up to, you know, the school or the place you're applying to then decide whether you get it. And from there on, I went back home. And a few weeks later, a letter came through the door box in the morning. I remember it well. It was a Saturday, which was why I was there when the post came. And it was a job offer in Santiago in Chile. And when I looked at it, except I went through the details, it looked pretty good. So I thought, why not? It was a part of the world that I knew very little about, but I knew the weather was good, I knew the wine was good, etc. and so on, and I thought, yeah, it's worth a go. So I signed the contract, put it in the return envelope, and put it in the post box. And in the afternoon, in those days there was a second post in the afternoon. What happened? Job interview and a job offer for Singapore. And I really didn't know what to do. I really did not know what to do. I really wanted to go to Singapore, but okay, I thought, right, I've signed and posted the other one, so Singapore went in the bin. That's how I ended up in Chile.
So you left Glasgow?
Yeah.
And to Chile?
Yeah.
Did you have any Spanish at the time?
No, señor.
¿Por qué no?
Esto es un elefante. That was about all the Spanish I had. I hadn't really, I hadn't bothered trying to learn Spanish then because that was not where I wanted to go. I was trying to learn Chinese. Didn't get very far with that either.
So how long did it take you to learn Spanish?
Well, there's a difference between learning a language, being fluent in a language, are two different things. You can learn a language to survive in it, and when you're immersed in the language itself and the culture and so on fairly quickly. But 6 months, your survival Spanish, as it's called, is okay. But the big problem was, you see, the school was a very expensive private school. One of the top schools, if not the top school in the whole of South America. And the overseas staff, of which there was about 10 of us all together, 10 families all together, all lived in flats in the actual school premises. So we were in this English-speaking bubble. You spoke English all day, you taught English all day, and virtually everyone in the school communicated in English because that was one of its main objectives as a British school, was to keep British English, British traditions alive. And it had been founded by an Englishman, of course. So I used to put myself in situations where I would go and speak to the gardeners, the workers in the school who didn't speak any English, to try and learn as much Spanish as possible. After about a year, I was, shall we say, communicatively fluent enough to be able to survive and get around. But by the end of 2 years, I was totally fluent.
Mm-hmm. You touched on it a wee bit earlier on. You were in Chile at a very interesting, complex time in terms of politics of the place.
Yeah.
Where were you in the middle of all that?
In the middle of Santiago.
How did you feel in the middle of the politics, I mean?
Well, it didn't really affect us very much because we lived in the school and you got most of your meals in the school during the day, school lunches, and which was because all the kids lunched in school. It was compulsory. You didn't actually have to go out into, shall we say, the city or whatever, except for a weekly, trip to the supermarket. And it was quite simple to do that because it's like walking around the Coop. You never talk to anyone in case you get whatever kind of reply.
No, the Coop and Tesco are the only place you can talk, and we better not say Tesco anymore.
Oh, times have changed, haven't they?
but the thing is, you were there at a very, maybe when looking at it now, an interesting time politically.
Yeah, my wife would be the one to tell you that because she lived through the whole process of the Pinochet coup and the Allende periods and so on, when the military government basically took over. And it was a difficult time, obviously, and again, without going into all the politics of that, you know, whether you're right wing or left wing or whatever, you know, that's up to individual people to interpret the politics of the time. There was a curfew when the first 3 years that I was there. Every night, Monday to Friday. But Saturday and Sunday there was no curfew, so you could stay out late, and the bars and the discotheques and things were open on Saturdays and Sundays. But the curfew was at 10 o'clock at night during the days of the week, which was actually pretty good, because it meant, first of all, there was no burglary went on, because there were armed soldiers on the street all the time. The traffic stopped, so traffic didn't keep you awake at night, city noise of traffic. And thirdly, it was most peculiar. During the holidays, whenever a holiday time, the curfew was lifted, so that people would, you know, disappear away on holiday. And then, you know, when you came back to school time and so on, the curfew was put back into place. It was actually, economically, it was a very good time for us, because the dollar had been fixed. The dollar peso rate had been fixed. So there was no fluctuation in it. And therefore we were earning a lot of money. And when they unfixed the dollar, I think the third year that they were there, our salaries in dollar terms were cut in half. We were getting the same amount of Chilean pesos, but it just didn't buy the same amount of dollars. And you bought dollars all the time so that you had a hard currency. Not that you could spend dollars in Chile. You could in Peru. It was very peculiar. In Peru, you could go anywhere and you could spend either dollars or soles. Chilean, Peruvian soles, you could spend them equally. They would take both currencies. Not in Chile, not even up until this day.
How would you describe the standard of living in Chile? Because you obviously were in a privileged position, as you have described there, but the general standard of living in the country itself at the time?
Well, it varied considerably according to, you know, where you were. Out in the countryside, in the south of Chile, it was big farming area, and people were very well off in terms of land management. The whole wine industry was booming at that time, as well as the export of fruit. That was one of the things the government sort of incentivated enormously, was the development of the export of particularly fruit and timber, huge amounts of timber. Because you have to bear in mind that a large part of the south of Chile at that time was totally unexplored. It was only, I have to climb up here again. It was only, this will do. There were no roads further south from here until the early 80s. So the whole of this section here was completely unexplored, except for a few fishing ports, and the only way you could get to it was by boat. And when that road was built, it only reached down, you probably can't see it from where you are, but there's a big lake there. And that is the furthest south the road goes. I have been fishing in that lake and caught my biggest rainbow trout ever.
Sure.
7.5 kilos.
And it wasn't even poached?
No, it was sushied. It was sushied. There's still this part here. There's a part here that there are no roads in. It's basically sort of volcanic. It's what's called the Ice Plateau area. And there are no roads in that part. But there are roads in the further south part here, all the way down. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Punta Arenas. You've heard of the most southerly town in the world. It's not actually the most southerly town in the world, Punta Arenas. But there were many Scottish people here in Punta Arenas, not just in the sheep farming. But I met a lady there. I was down there at a conference in Punta Arenas, and I knew this lady lived there. She was quite famous in the region. Her parents were from Achmore, and she turned out to be a distant cousin of my father. And I went to visit her. And she was well into her late 80s then. This was 1987. And I spoke to her in Gaelic. And she answered me back in Gaelic. And she told me that she had been brought up, she had been sent from there, from Punta Arenas, when the First World War started. She had been sent from there back to Achmore to be brought up in Achmore until the war was over. And then she went back.
Aye.
Yeah.
Well, there's somebody in the front row there who can maybe identify who you're talking about there, and might even be related, but we can get you talking to each other again.
Peggy Fell. Yeah.
So Shinaga there. But of course, you're talking about the roads, but I remember you telling me a story one time about there are geographical and geological features down there that we don't have here.
Like volcanoes.
And the one I wanted you to tell them about was the earthquakes in the car.
Oh. Yeah. You have to get used to the ground moving underneath you at least once a month or so. Shakes, small shakes were quite common. And as long as you had small shakes where maybe, the glass would swing, the windows would rattle, etc., at least once a month, then nobody got really very nervous about it. Because the theory was that if there were small shakes regularly, it was releasing the pressure, and therefore a big earthquake wouldn't come. And we had been down visiting my mother-in-law on the coast. She lived, I keep having to do this. She lived in a beautiful city, which I'm sure many of you have heard of the name of Valparaiso.
Oh, yeah.
But she lived next to Valparaiso, which is on the coast, about here. And we used to go down almost every weekend, well, not every weekend, but at least once a month we used to go down, especially in the summer. We would spend the summer there because the weather was nice. Average temperature 30, 35 degrees, etc. Beaches, sun. What more could you ask for? And it was a very strange weekend. It was the weekend of the 3rd of March. I remember the date very well, because the school was supposed to open on the Monday. And it was Sunday evening, and we were driving back up. So it's about 120 kilometres, so it's not much. So it's one of the fascinating things. You could be on the beach in the morning and go skiing in the afternoon. The mountains and the beach were that close. And although I never did both on the same day, there were people who did do it. But again, that was one of the beauties of, in the winter time, the skiing was really good, really quite pleasant. The weather had been peculiar. It's one of these things that people say that there had been a number of shocks during the few days before, which people thought, okay, fine, that's just the way the pressure is. But one of the things we noticed was that the sea was very unusual. It had a very unusual colour. It was flat calm. And that is not something you often see, because there's always, being sort of wide open Pacific, you always have waves coming in, obviously, from, distance away. And as we drove up from Santiago, from Valparaiso, and onto the road that heads, you're coming up from sea level up to about 1,000 feet. It's not that high, but I remember Marcella turning around and saying, she says, there's something funny about the way the sea looks. Well, okay, I just didn't pay much attention to it after that. And we were just on the outskirts of Santiago when the earthquake struck. Now, if you can imagine, all this happened in a matter of seconds. I was driving. It was a 3-lane highway, motorway, either side. And my first comment was, where does that wind come from? Because I could feel, the car beginning to move. And the only time I'd ever experienced anything like that was in a Lewis gale, when the car is getting blown over a wee bit. And then I thought, must have a puncture, because, it was the typical movement that you get in a puncture. And it was then that I noticed that the road in front of me was rippling. It was beginning to ripple. And Marcella said, she sort of yelled at me. She said, stop, it's an earthquake. And by the time I managed to stop, it was really going full on then. And you could see the road was lifting maybe about 3 or 4 feet, and splits appearing in it. And the thing I remember most was, I looked in my mirror, the car mirror, before I managed just to, trying to stop, you want to see what's around you. There were 2 policemen behind us, about maybe 10, 20 yards behind us on motorbikes. And they both fell off. They couldn't keep the motorbikes upright, they were flat. And I managed to stop by the side of the road, and we got out of the car, and I remember that I couldn't stand still without holding on to the roof of the car. And I looked across the road, and there was a petrol station on the other side of the road, and the petrol pumps were bouncing up and down. I thought, this whole lot's going to explode any minute. And didn't. And it was a long earthquake. It lasted for 1.5 minutes, and that is very, very long by earthquake standards. That was the biggest one we had. And when we got home, what a mess. It took us 1.5 hours to get home for a journey that normally takes 15 minutes from there. And that was because, of course, power was out. There were no traffic lights. The roads were pretty much gridlocked then with cars, just people couldn't get through junctions. And everyone was out on the street, because one of the things you do after an earthquake, you get out onto the street in case the second big shock comes and you're then caught inside. But and we had earthquake drills when we went into the school that night. A lot of masonry had fallen in various places. We had earthquake drills in school at least once every term. That was common. And what would you do in an earthquake?
I don't know. What did you say? Probably as you. Were you frightened?
No.
Were you not?
No. The funny thing was, I was so fascinated by what was going on that I didn't have time to be frightened. Because I remember one of the teachers had said to me, if you're ever outside Santiago when an earthquake happens, he said, make sure you look up at the mountains. And I remember looking up at the mountains, and the cloud of dust rising from the mountains was spectacular.
Sure.
It was afterwards that I was frightened. Especially when I got home and we saw the mess. The cocktail cabinet, if one would call it that was in the house, which was, full of glasses and various other things we won't mention. Every single thing was on the floor, and everything was broken except a bottle of whiskey. Isn't that funny? It had fallen out, it was on the carpet, but it hadn't broken. But every other drink that was in the thing was smashed.
It was left as sustenance to enable you to get over the shock.
Absolutely, except I don't like whiskey.
I found that story, because you told me that years ago, just absolutely fascinating. But most of the time you were in Chile, is in 2 places. One was Santiago, and the other was Conception.
Yeah.
What was the difference between the 2 places?
Well, Conception is more to the south. It's about 600 kilometres further south. It's down about here, and it's on the coast there. And in fact, not long after we left there, that was 1989 we left there, we were back here for 2 years before we went back to Santiago again. there was a major earthquake in that area that destroyed quite a lot of the city. I moved down there. I was offered a job as deputy head of the British school in Conception, so we spent 3 years down there.
What was the difference between the two towns?
Well, Concepcion was a much smaller city, of course. Santiago at that time had a population of about 4 million, whereas Concepcion was coming up to 1 million, round about that. Concepcion was much more, along with its port city, Talcahuano, it was much more a sort of fishing, farming community, and a lot of timber work as well. There was a lot of forestry activity down there.
What was the prevailing religious disposition there at the time?
Oh, Catholic. Roman Catholic, just to make it clear, Roman Catholic, which was actually very advantageous much later, because it's very easy to speak to people about God, because they have a predisposition to believe that God exists, to accept the existence of God. They know about Jesus Christ. They know about, of course, the Virgin Mary, who is extremely important, and they're willing to listen. Now, things have changed. Our family, who were across just now for my daughter's wedding this summer, tell us that it's not like that anymore. There's been so much immigration into Chile, particularly from Venezuela and from Haiti and Colombians, that Chile has become, how can one put it? It's very different to the Chile that I knew. It's become...
Cosmopolitan?
That would be the wrong word, because they're very separate communities, but it's become...
fragmented?
Much more gang-controlled than it was. You see, one of the good things, good in inverted commas, about having a military government is that there's law and order. And therefore, that was maintained pretty thoroughly. Now, unfortunately, it's hard to say this, but a consequence of democratic government is that law and order seems to disappear. And it's not, maybe there are financial reasons. I mean, that's an area you could argue about for a long time. But it's the Santiago today, Chile today is very different to the Chile that I went out to.
That would be a very interesting philosophical discussion which we have raised there, which we haven't got time for tonight, and which we probably better not pursue here. But did you come across much of the indigenous population, the indigenous original populations of Chile?
Yes, but only when we travelled. When you go down into the south of Chile, you come across what's called the Mapuche Indians. They were never conquered by the Spanish. One has to bear in mind, that the majority of coastal population in South America is a mestizo mix of Spanish and European influences over the centuries, ever since the Spanish conquistadores conquered most of South America. The Spanish never got down to Concepcion, to that further area. And that whole area to the south, in the south of Chile there, is Indians. Basically, I suppose you would call them crofters, if we were using Lewis terminology, working the land, etc., and so on, and raising cattle, particularly beef cattle, and so on. And then the further south you go, the more indigenous Indian communities there were. Some of them are extinct. And in fact, on the trip to, when we were in south of Punta Arenas here, Punta Arenas is here, and we were down in the furthest southern part of Chile here, which is a little town called Puerto Williams, which is a Chilean naval base on the most southerly island there. And we met the last surviving purebred Indian lady of that particular area. She was the last one.
That's sad.
Yeah. It's a very interesting history. There's a book, I don't know if you can get it in this country, but it's written, it was about a Scottish missionary family called Bridges, who went out to Ushuaia in Argentina. But Ushuaia is just on the other side of the Beagle Channel. from there and farmed there for years. And their descendants, one of them was a pupil in the school that I was working in. And he had written a book, it's called To the Uttermost Ends of the Earth, if you can find it anywhere. And it tells the story of that family coming out from Scotland, settling in Ushuaia, and beginning the process of evangelization of the Indians, and how the Indians gradually were exterminated by the white settlers. But very much similar to the story of what happens in the USA. I mean, it's wherever the white man goes. You know, the Spanish started it. First of all, they bring their diseases that these people had no resistance against. And then secondly, they tend to exploit them for slave labour. And, well, the rest is history.
Yeah. Well, all this is history and new to a lot of us. And what we're going to do now is, I'll ask one more question. Then we're going to have a break for a cup of tea. And then we'll maybe talk a bit about Peru as well as the difference. And then any of you who have any questions or any observations will be free to do so. So I was just going to say, before we go to, you came back here,
yeah,
and then you went back to Chile.
Yeah.
Was there much difference between the Chile you went to first time and the Chile you went back to?
The major difference was that the military government, Pinochet, he'd stood down and they'd allowed 3 elections. So it was in the transition period between a military dictatorship and then going into a full democratic rule. That was the major difference. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So coming back to this country after being there for a long time, what were your observations at that time, not just now, but at that time?
Of this country?
Yeah.
Well, first thing that happened when we came back was I couldn't get a job. And I ended up getting a job. Neil Galbraith, who was I'm sure everyone knows, at the time he said, this is the only job I've got going, he says, is in Uist. So we ended up working in Uist, in Coinneach, and living in South Uist. And that for Marcella was a major eye-opener, because A, it was the middle of winter, B, we lived just outside Loch Boysdale, and it was about the most isolated spot in the whole of Uist, where the only person she saw all day was the postman, and the rest of the time she was on her own while I was at school.
What village was it?
Milton. Milton. And of course, if you didn't get to the shop when the ferry came in, which was Tuesdays and Thursdays in those days, if you didn't get there within an hour or two of the ferry coming, there was nothing left for the rest of the week. It was, it was really the back of beyond, I mean, Chile was much more civilized than Uist was at that time. Sorry to say that, but Lima was great. I really enjoyed working in Lima. A nice time there.
No, I've heard part of the story of why then you decided to go back to Chile again, but that was interesting in itself, wasn't it?
Well, it was. I mean, after being in Uist for 6 months, I got a transfer to the Nicholson. And I was quite happy in the English department in the Nicholson, along with Tom Clark and the other boys there and so on. And we had no thoughts. Marcella was working in the Cala Hotel then, and we had no thoughts of going back to Chile at all. And I got a phone call, and I think it was around about February, from my former headmaster at the Grange in Santiago, who said, basically, to cut a long story short, he said, got a job going as a head of secondary, will you come back? And really, I didn't know what to say to that. And we talked about it. I said, give me a month to think about it, etc., and so on. And we spoke about it, and big worry was my father. My father was on his own. He was getting old, of course, etc., and so on. And I still remember his answer very clearly. We talked about it, and he said in Gaelic, of course, "Oh, halas, Ashin." You're only a phone call away. That was what he said. And it was based on that. We'd fixed a house site, and we were about to start building a house on the other side of the road then, and eventually we decided to go back.
It's all very interesting indeed, and I'm sure we're all finding it very interesting. There's going to be a cup of tea, but maybe ask the minister to say the grace before a cup of tea there.
Thank you, Lord, for your goodness, your provision, what we enjoy from your hand day by day, for this opportunity to spend some time together. We thank you, Lord, for your provision at this meeting and all the goodness that we enjoy from your hand. We ask your blessing upon us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you. We'll come back together in about 15 minutes, if that's okay, and then we'll move on to Peru, and then any questions or anybody's got anything. Well, the cup of tea was nice, and our thanks very much indeed to the ladies. Thank you very much, ladies, for giving us a cup of tea. And we now carry on our journey in South America. And we're cutting all this very short because John has lots of stories he could tell about a lot of these places and what he was doing. But now we're going to move a bit north, Peru, which is a different country in many ways to the Chile that we were talking about before.
Absolutely, totally different. In fact, that was one of the biggest surprises that we had when we moved to Peru. First of all, the Spanish was different. I'll tell you some funny stories about. There are certain words that mean, they're the same words, but they mean different things in different countries. And if you don't know them, you can get into very embarrassing situations. We expected it to be very similar because the two countries are side by side. They're not, they're chalk and cheese. Peruvians are completely different to Chileans. There's a marked difference between people in Peru who come from the coast, who tend to be mestizo, that is, usually of mixed European descent. There are black people in Peru who come from descendants of the slaves. There was no slavery in Chile at all, or in Argentina, which is why there were no indigenous coloured populations there. But there is in Peru. Then the people of the mountains, the Andes Mountains, are a different race altogether. They're Indians, but they're totally different to any of the Indian people that we met, even in the north of Chile, in the desert areas in the north of Chile. They speak similar languages, but the main language is Quechua. There's also Aymara and various others. And then when you go into the jungle areas of Peru, which you can only do by flying, or because there's virtually no roads, or you go by riverboat, which takes a long time. Then you come across tribal groups in so many different places of the Amazon, some of whom have no contact whatsoever with civilization, and they don't want any contact with civilization. And at times, I think they've got the right idea.
They have civilization.
They have their own civilization. They live off the jungle, etc. They know how to maintain the jungle. But, of course, again, well, that's another area of discussion.
Just for a word or two, the politics of Peru is interesting too, isn't it?
Oh, the politics of Peru. Peru in terms of politics is a joke. I mean, that's the only word for it. It is the most inept, corrupt series of governments. You can go back to, hundreds of years and you find corrupt. It's very interesting when you look at the governments, particularly in places like Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, etc. and so on, and then you come to the northern Pacific coast. The level of corruption, the further north you go, the more corruption seemed to be endemic in Peru. You couldn't get anything done without having a bribe. It was impossible. We couldn't even get the books that we imported for the school out of the custom unless you paid a bribe to the customs agent, which of course, being a Christian school as it was in Peru, the headmaster refused to do. So the book sat there in the customs shed for months and months and months, until eventually, I don't know if someone paid the bribe or whatever, but you couldn't get anything done in Peru. Even the policemen, if the police stopped you, when you handed over your driving license, your documents, your ID card, etc., and so on, and you usually had a folded note inside them, and you would then get them back without the note, of course. Nothing was ever said, but then fine, you were on your way. I mean, you were talking about maybe £1 or £2. That was all. But it was endemic to anything that you did in Peru. Chile wasn't like that at all.
Now, the school you went to there is, we've seen in the monthly record over many, many years mention of Colegio San Andres.
Yeah.
That's a Christian school. Different to the ones you'd been in before, and was that the motivating force of you going there?
It was different, and that was the motivating force for going there, yeah. When basically our time was up in Chile, and it was time to move on, that was my first choice. I was offered 3 different headmasterships in Chile. I turned them all down to go to Peru. Which for the first 2 years we thought was the biggest mistake of our lives.
Sure. Why?
Because, why? Peru is an amazing country to visit as a tourist. Lima is a fascinating city to visit as a tourist. It's one of the most horrendous cities I've ever been in to live in and to work in. The traffic is chaotic. They'll steal anything from you that they can steal. It was like chalk and cheese. You can't drive with the windows of your car down, because when you stop at a traffic light, before you know it, a hand comes in through the window and will steal your glasses or anything else they can lay their hands on. The level of theft in Peru is endemic, which is really sad, because they're a very creative people. They never throw anything away in Peru. They can fix anything. I'll tell you a story here. In 1975, when my father retired from this congregation, he was given a clock. And some of you, Johanna and friends, will remember the presentation of the clock. It was in his book, who gave it to him on behalf of the congregation. And the clock is basically a nice 8-day clock, etc. Bentina, because that was Jan Nish's favourite make at the time. And there was a plaque on it, said, presented to Rowan. And I took the clock with me when we moved to Peru. It was, on our house. And one day when I was winding it, the mainspring broke. So I took it down to a local watchmaker fairly close to where we lived, and I explained to him what the problem was and said to him, can you do anything? I said, I'll have a look at it and see. Went back following week, and he said, yeah, it's fixed, he said. He said, I also had to replace 2 other parts in it that were broken as well. I said, where did you get the spares? I said, oh, I made them. Just like that. He made them. Still sits on the mantelpiece in our house, and it's working perfectly, and that's, 17 and 8, 20 odd years later. Still working perfectly. They could fix anything, but they could steal anything as well. If there was anything you wanted rid of, the system of rubbish collecting, there were no bins like we have here. What there was there was a metal pole outside your house, usually on the street, with a basket in it. So that every day, you put your black rubbish bag or anything else you wanted out. And what people used to do was anything you wanted rid of, like something old, whatever, a covered chair, so you just leave it outside. It'd be gone in 5 minutes. And then it would appear resold. The pastor of the Anglican Church the Anglican Church is very strong in Latin America and very, I was going to say correct, but then I looked at Colin's face and I thought I better not say that. But it's a very powerful evangelical church, and it works very well in Latin America. It's much more powerful in Chile than it is in Peru, but in Peru it's still quite important. And the pastor, the minister of the Anglican Church, he's an Anglo-Peruvian, came out one morning from his house to find that all 4 wheels of his car were missing. And the car was stacked up on bricks, but there was no sign of the wheels. Now, he knew it's very common in Peru to have your spare wheels stolen, etc. and so on, but not usually all 4. And he had marked the rims of the wheels, he had engraved them all with a car number plate. So there's a market in downtown Lima that you go to, and if you want parts for your car or anything, wing mirrors, I used to get my wing mirrors stolen regularly until you engraved the glass on the wing mirror with the number plate. He bought his own 4 wheels in the market, same morning, put them back on the car. That was not unusual. It was a totally different kind of society. There was a marked difference between rich and poor in Lima. And one of the major reasons for that was the influx of people who had come. If I mention the term Sendero Luminoso, does it mean anything to
Shining light.
The shining light, the shining path, the Marxist movement that started in the mountains of Peru and caused havoc. And many of the people fled from the mountains to the city, to Lima, particularly to Lima. And Lima became surrounded by shanty towns then. They used to call them in Spanish misery towns. And some of them were absolutely miserable. No water, no running water, no electricity, nothing. Just wooden shacks, basically in the middle of the desert. That influx of people not only did not become accepted into the society in Lima, but sort of like formed a separate city round about the periphery of the capital. And these people were incredibly poor because they'd been forced, to leave under threat of death from many of them. And there are many, many stories, I'm sure you've heard of them. An evangelical church, many evangelical churches, of course, were not only persecuted, but there was one, I may have told this story before, there was one particular church in a town called Ayacucho, which was, I've got a stick now, so this is... what have you done?
I'm scared of your stick.
It's not a magic stick anyway.
Anyway,
That is.
these churches were up the mountains, the Andes Mountains, of course, run down this part of Peru. And they were basically up in this section here, central Peru, which is referred to as the Sierra. And in one famous occasion in a church, an evangelical church, Protestant church in Ayacucho, it was surrounded by the guerrillas of the Shining Path. And they basically said, there are many other stories of similar things happening, but they said, we want everyone in here who's a professing Christian to raise their hand. And they took them all outside and shot them. And they came back to a town a little bit further up the mountains a few weeks later, surrounded another church, and said exactly the same thing. Everyone who's a professing Christian, stand up. And of course, these people knew what had happened in the other church. But the majority of them still stood up. And they said to them, At least you have the courage of your convictions. You go free. And they shot everyone else who stayed inside the church. Now that was not uncommon. By the time we went to Peru, that had settled. It was more or less over, although there were still some guerrilla activities, bomb activities and so on taking place. But most of it was then and has been still, it's correct, connected to the narco traffic. Peru is a major producer of cocaine, as I'm sure you well know. And if you haven't tried cocaine, it's good for you. In its unadulterated form, in the pure form of the leaf. Now, you can walk into any supermarket in Peru, in Lima or anywhere else, and you can buy cocaine tea bags. The coca leaf tea bag. And you infuse your water with it in exactly the same way as you would with a tea bag here. Exactly the same. It's very good for headaches, and it's very good especially as well if you are going up into the mountains and you have altitude sickness. And the first time I ever came across it was actually we were travelling in the north of Chile, my wife and I, up here. And we had gone from the coast up to the border with Bolivia there to visit what is supposed to be the highest lake in the world and to see the flamingos that were on that lake. Beautiful place. A big volcano beside it as well. And on the way down, when we were driving down, we had given a lift to a Chilean policeman from the border post who was actually going on leave, and he asked us if we could take him back down, to the main town on the coast. Yeah, no problem. And I got soroche, altitude sickness, on the way down, because you're coming down from about 5,000 meters, and very quickly down. And he said, I know what's wrong with you, he said. He opened his bag and he said, chew that, I'll fix it. Coca leaves. He had a handful of coca leaves in his bag. And you cannot, the majority of people who work at altitude are constantly chewing coca leaves simply for that reason.
Did it work?
Absolutely. Thoroughly recommended. Thoroughly recommended.
Well, that's a first for Bach Free Church.
That is the leaf in its natural form, of course. And there are large areas of Peru, particularly Peru and Colombia, particularly in the regions round about here, this section here, which is basically given over to growing coca and cocaine and the production of cocaine. And although it's illegal to do so, nevertheless, they can't stamp it out. And there's a lot of it. The Americans have been involved heavily in trying to stop it as well, and the same in Colombia. But the amount of corruption and the amount of money that flows into government coffers from that as well, who knows what goes on there. But it's a huge trade. You see, there's only one way of stopping it. If there's no demand for it, then there's no point in producing it. And you say to a poor farmer somewhere up in the mountains of Peru, who's getting maybe £1 an acre for growing potatoes or whatever else he grows, when he can get £20 an acre for growing coca, what's he going to say to you? Why shouldn't I grow it? I says, you're the ones who are consuming it, not me. He says, that's what I feed my family on. And you can see the logic of the argument. But how do you stop it? The only way you can stop it, of course, it's like anything else, is the demand has to stop.
The problem isn't with them, it's with us.
Yes, it is.
Having said that, though, coming back to the school you were in.
Which one?
The Colegio San Andres.
Oh, right.
You know, What kind of a school was that? Because we read about that many people who have achieved very high positions in Peru have come through that school with its Christian ethic.
Yes. Again, you have to bear in mind, the same was true in Argentina and in Uruguay and in most places as well, that most of the education, most of the quality education that exists in Latin American countries is private. And therefore, anyone who can will send their kid to a private school. Now, again, there are different levels of private schools. Some of them are, frankly, not worth calling schools, but that's, a different thing altogether. But there are others that are very high class and very, very good educational institutions. Colegio San Andres had been founded in 1917, if I remember correctly, by Johnny Macaulay. Now, again, I'm not going to go into the story. I'm sure you're familiar with the story of Johnny Macaulay, or if you're not, you can find it online quite easily. He eventually, when he founded the school, it started off as a school basically for boys. In fact, at first it was actually for girls as well, but the girls only lasted a few years. I didn't say that right, but never mind. But the ethic of the school was a quality education, but given in Spanish, not in English. Colegio San Andres did not really attempt to teach English in its early years. But most of the staff were very highly qualified Peruvian staff, and the quality of education was very good. And that made it stand out from many of it's the oldest British school in South America, which is saying something. And again, the quality of British education at that time was world known. We used to have the best education in the world. That's gone. But that was exported overseas in British schools. And you found it again in Latin America, because each of the sort of colonies of people who had come from Europe, the Spanish, there was a Spanish school, there was a French school, there was a German school, there was a Swiss school, and there were enclaves, within the country who tried, and they were supported by their own embassies. They got financial help. The British schools never did. Didn't need it, really, because they were, too popular. Colegio San Andres became very, very, as it developed, became important. The next headmaster was actually from the next croft in Carloway at first. Donald Macaulay. It's interesting that two of us from two adjoining crofts in Carloway became headmasters of the same school, obviously with
on the other side of the world.
On the other side of the world, with a big difference of years between the two. By the time, just after I went there, as the Shining Path thing had died down, the school was in severe difficulty at that time. Mainly because the number of pupils had dropped. Again, of course, your income depends on the number of pupils. And because of the economic situation in Peru, the amount of people who could afford private education had dropped considerably. It began to rise again during the period that I was there, but I think it's quite steady now.
I'm conscious of the fact that time is moving on. I am sure that everybody here would like to keep on listening to you for ages, but things...
no problem.
Yeah, but they might have homes to go to.
So do I.
So what I was going to say, anybody got any questions? Let's open it out, just because I'm sure some people got some questions. Has anybody got any questions that they'd like to ask Donald?
You were talking about the different words. You didn't follow up.
Oh, I didn't give you examples of that. There was a word that was used in Chile, particularly for young people, for teenagers, which was lolos. Lolos and lolas, the feminine, which was simply meant teenagers. And one morning in the church that we were in at that time in Lima, I said to, it wasn't an English-speaking church, fully Spanish, I said to one of the elders, I said, you don't seem to have very many, and I used the word lolos, in your congregation. And he sort of looked at me and frowned and said, oh, we don't have any of those here. I was a bit taken aback by that. So I used another word, which turned out to be a Chilean slang word again. And he said to me, brother, he said, there's no need for that kind of language here. I was really, I mean, one is taken totally aback because you don't know what you've said wrong. So I asked someone later on, I said, you know, what happened? And he started laughing and he said, lolos in Peru means prostitutes. Well, I don't suppose you can tell if there are prostitutes in the congregation. How would you know? But instead of telling us, you know, these kind of mistakes, very often people just got annoyed and assumed that you were being rude or something. Mm-hmm.
I think William now is regretting having asked you.
I'll give you a simple example of it. Just before school term started, like one does, you have to rearrange your classroom and so on. And one of the workers was helping me rearrange the desks. And I counted the desks and I said to him, you know, I need more desks here. And I used the word that I would have used in Chile, which was bancos. And he looked at me strangely and he said, bancos, hermano? Everyone in Chile is hermano. Hermano means brother. You're all brothers and sisters. In Peru. Whereas I think they used it as an excuse because they couldn't be bothered remembering your name. But that's just the way it was a term that was used all the time. And this conversation went on for a while until I realized that the word that I was using for a desk obviously meant something totally different. What it meant basically in Peru was the kind of bench you put outside, you know, that you sit on outside. Whereas in Chile it meant, you know, the actual desk and chair that you sat on. Eventually we managed to sort it out, but there were lots of things like that.
Any other questions that might not enter into that territory? Okay.
Can I ask a political one? After a certain country interfered in the political landscape of Chile and was involved in the overthrow of Allende, what is the attitude?
Referring to the United States, of course.
Yes. What is the attitude of the average Chileno nowadays to the United States of America?
Well, nowadays I wouldn't be 100% sure. I mean, I can only go on, you know, what our family tell us when they were here in summertime. That the US interfered in Chilean domestic politics, there's no question whatsoever about that, because the last thing that the US wanted was a socialist, possibly communist, Castro-influenced, from Russia-influenced state, you know, on its doorstep. The interference was huge, absolutely huge. The problem really is, there's a saying in Latin America, it says, if America catches a cold, if America sneezes, if the US sneezes, Latin America gets a fever. And that economically, that's the real problem, because everything is mainly controlled through the US dollar. And therefore the value of the US dollar is so important in everything that goes on. And what used to have happened, a totally different example. Most cars in Latin America used to come from Brazil and Argentina. They were actually built in Brazil and in Argentina. Where are they coming from now? China. The Chinese influence on the Pacific coast of America is becoming enormous. Enormous. How do people see the US? Some love it, some hate it. Every Peruvian's dream is to emigrate to the United States, unfortunately. And some of them do, and some of them do very well. But, I mean, you're aware of the stories that happen every day of the mass migration, particularly from Central America up into, well, we all know what Trump is shouting about on that just now. And it is a serious problem. And the only way that you're going to solve it is when the Latin American countries sort out their own economic situation. Argentina at the moment is a disaster. So are most of the other countries.
Okay. Greta, after having been in South America yourself a few times, and of course Greta's written a book about Patagonia and her photos. Did you have any observations or questions about anything Donald John said?
No, I'm just mesmerised by how much she knows.
Did you say that did you not tell me that you knocked at the door of a school one time and he wasn't there?
Yes, it was away on his holidays.
Well, you see, the holidays were January and February. That was our summer holiday, because the seasons, of course, have reversed. Yeah.
Go to the you asked the question.
I did quite a lot on the east coast of South America, and we went one time for bananas to Ecuador.
Yeah.
And we were warned when we went there that they were notorious thieves. And we thought we had everything sealed up. They couldn't pinch anything.
Anything.
But far from they got away with a lot of things.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the accommodation.
Yeah. Were you in Callao?
Pardon?
In Callao in Peru? The port of Lima?
Ecuador.
But you didn't come down to Peru itself?
No.
No, it's just the same. That's why everything goes in and out in containers, and even half the time half the containers disappear. You know, theft is like an endemic game in Latin America. Yeah, it's an honourable profession.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think we'd better go down that road too far either. Any other points that anybody would like to raise with Tony? You know, there are many. I was
just going to say on theft. You know how the theft of mobile phones has become endemic in London, etc., particularly with guys on motorbikes. They were doing that in Peru long before it started here.
Aye?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That was very. I saw it outside the school one day. There was a guy standing, and he had his phone, in his back pocket there. And I saw this guy just walking down the street. And he just went over to him and grabbed the phone. 2 seconds later, there was a motorbike, he jumps on it, and the other guy, and they drive off. The guy, before he's realised his phone is gone, it's down at the next traffic light. There's nothing you can do about it. You know, it's just the way it is.
We could carry on, and I'm sure you can have a word with Don John afterwards. But we'll bring this part to a close, but I'm going to do same as I did say to Angus MacLennan, who's chairman of the Coinneach, that he should come up and say a word or two.
Does he need the stick?
That was. Are you intending to go back?
Sorry?
Are you intending to go back, Wayne?
No. Too old, too expensive, too long a flight now.
That leads up to that question that I was going to ask. We've heard Don's perspective of being over there. I know Marcella quite well, having worked with her. It would be fascinating to hear her reflections on being in Lewis, not just once but twice now. So, is there any chance she might do this kind of thing?
If you spoke to her very nicely with a large financial incentive on
And didn't tell her husband.
I think that would be quite fascinating to see, her perspective of.
Absolutely, I'm sure she would be very interested if her health was good enough that she might be able to do it.
Well, I found it fascinating. It was really, really well structured. I think it worked well with kind of asking the questions, much more interactive. Thank you for attending. Thank you for asking the questions. South America, very unusual topics, I suppose, for a community to be discussing, but I think it was an excellent and inspired suggestion. We came up with it to ask him to come. For myself personally, it was very, very interesting. I had 2 granduncles who were out in Patagonia as shepherds. Their daughter of one of them just died last year, and she was fluent in Spanish and English till the age of 8, till they came back home to house, no English at all came to house. That was quite fascinating for me. And
Do they speak English in Harris?
Not then they didn't.
And the Gaelic is as different as the Spanish was in Peru.
The fact that we've got Donald recording everything for us as well makes it even better that a much wider audience can listen to the repository of materials that we're now collecting, seeing the communities up and running again. So my thanks to Donald for doing the recordings as well. You're all aware of the devastating loss we had recently with Sandra's passing. We were at a low ebb then. Thankfully, Ken Gordy from Balalan, that some of you might know, has stepped into the breach. He's doing a really, really good job for us, getting everything up and running again, making sure that we keep going. And one of the best things about it is that on a Wednesday morning, 11 o'clock, there's a gathering, a cup of coffee, a chat, nothing formal, and we've got quite a good attendance now. So anybody is very welcome to come in, drop in, have a yarn. We go through some old photos, go through some of the archive materials that we've got, or just have a chat, and somebody, usually like Diane there, taking notes. You never know what nuggets are going to come out of these conversations. We'll even go as far maybe as giving you some cocaine the next time. Instead of the coffee, quite probably coffee.
You can get it on Amazon.
Please come along. You'll drop in anytime. You're very welcome, and the more the merrier. So this is the first of the winter series of talks. A very successful one. Hope to build on it in coming months. So, Kier Time, laat gewoon dat Coinneach. Dus dan goed te delen was als een tekens, en one final plea, if you know anybody at all interested in the development officer's job, it's got out on social media at the moment, and please try and persuade people to apply for it. That please.